Eric, I think materialism is correct, but I hope it is not. And if it is not, one of the ways to discern that it's not is through the techniques of philosophical metaphysics. Metaphysics is a word that often has connotations commonly that are not the philosophical ones. But as a philosopher, using the techniques and ways of thinking of metaphysics, how can you put materialism to the test?
Well, I think it's hard to test materialism exactly because I think the tools that we have for addressing metaphysical questions are pretty frail. But one of the things that metaphysics does, or metaphysicians can do, are thought experiments. And I guess one of the things that I have been interested in recently is using thought experiment metaphysical techniques, sometimes science fiction techniques, to explore what I think of as some of the bizarre seeming consequences of materialism, right? So part of the background of this is that I think that our folk opinions about the metaphysics of mind are incoherent. So any well-developed coherent view is going to have to conflict with some aspect of this incoherent set.
What's an example of an incoherent way of thinking that we would have?
So one of the things that I've been interested in recently is group consciousness. So I think it's possible that if you accept certain kinds of things that materialists tend to like to say, that they seem to imply that groups of human beings, maybe even the United States as it's actually currently constructed, is literally phenomenally conscious, has a stream of conscious experience over and above the experiences of all the individual people who are part of it.
And you're saying that as a serious comment because that sounds absurd.
Well, part of my view is that any well-developed metaphysical position is going to have some consequences that sound absurd.
And that's very interesting because if that were the case, if on a metaphysical analysis of materialism, you would come to the conclusion that the United States as an entity possibly could be phenomenologically conscious, and you think that's absurd, then you have to question the tenets of materialism.
Yes, I think the seeming absurdity of it creates pressure against materialism. If it's true, as I think it is, that a kind of natural way of developing materialism would have that consequence.
Okay, so first of all, let's understand how that would be the case. If you are fully committed to a materialistic worldview, how then is a consequence of that the United States as an entity would be a phenomenally conscious thing?
Right. So let me answer that, but just before I answer it, let me just add to the thing that I was previously saying, that I don't take it strictly as a reductio ad absurdum, right? The fact that it seems absurd that the United States is conscious, I think does create some commonsensical pressure against materialism, if it has that implication. Yeah. But I also think that that's not, that since something absurd, seemingly absurd, must be true about the mind, maybe that is the absurd true thing.
Okay.
Right? So I take it as, maybe that's what maybe materialism is true, and that's what materialism shows us, and we should accept that.
And you have to follow that course. Okay, that's a fair comment.
So I'm not sure which way to go with it.
Fine.
But here's the general structure of the argument. Most materialists think that rabbits have conscious experience, and that seems right to me. It seems plausible to me. I mean, after all, they're a lot like us, biologically, neurophysiologically. Most materialists, although I think there's more disagreement about this, also think that highly sophisticated, weirdly constructed aliens would be conscious.
Oh, sure.
And, right, so if you imagine a being on another planet made out of hydraulics or made out of fiber optics, right? If it behaves in a really sophisticated way in response to its environment, if it emits behavior that we would be inclined to interpret as linguistic, maybe it learns you can imagine it visiting us, learning English, speaking to us, talking to us about philosophy, talking to us about the mind-body problem, right? Most people, if it looked and behaved and acted enough like us and was linguistic, most people would be inclined to say, I think, yeah, that being has a real stream of conscious experience. Within the general materialist framework, it seems very plausible that there are a variety of different ways that such beings could be constructed or could evolve that would be very different from neurons and still could emit that complex pattern of behavior. So you probably think those are conscious if you're a materialist, probably.
Yes.
One way of creating highly sophisticated alien being is by means of clustering together groups of conscious beings. So you might imagine, say, a highly evolved ant colony, if ants are conscious. Or if you don't think ants are conscious, make it naked mole rats, right? Some sorts of beings that are individually conscious, but interact in a highly complex way to produce very sophisticated linguistic behavior, maybe that they themselves either do or don't, it doesn't really matter. Understand, right? I think if you accept weirdly constructed aliens as being conscious, then you probably ought to accept that there are conditions under which groups of conscious beings would be conscious.
At a supraconscious level. So even if the individuals were conscious as individuals, that the combination of them, the interaction of them, would have a separate, independent consciousness.
That's exactly right. So one way to be kind of clearer about this, I don't think this is necessary to the construction of the thought experiment, is to think about the individuals as being dumber than the super entity, right? So maybe the individual naked mole rats or ants don't understand anything about Shakespeare, right? But somehow the entity is capable of emitting sophisticated opinions about Shakespeare, says, I read King Lear, it made me really sad, right? But no naked mole rat knows that, right? So I think it's plausible to accept a materialist view on which groups of conscious beings, if they emitted sophisticated enough behavior, would be conscious. Now, if you go back and think about rabbits, then you might think, well, the behavior might not have to be all that sophisticated, right? Because you might have the alien equivalent of a rabbit constructed in a group way, right? So just as we are conscious, and because we're similar to rabbits, we think rabbits are conscious, you might have alien, highly sophisticated group entities who are conscious. There might be a similar type of entity to them that's less sophisticated, alien rabbits that are group entities. It seems like you ought to extend consciousness to those beings. You wouldn't, I think, normally think that in a group entity you'd suddenly have highly sophisticated consciousness and there'd be no evolutionary precursors of it. So it seems to me pretty plausible to think on a materialist view that even relatively unsophisticated, or rabbit-like sophisticated, rabbits are somewhat sophisticated entities, group entities, could be conscious. And then the idea is the United States is basically a relatively unsophisticated group entity of more or less rabbit-like intelligence, right? And if you think about the kinds of things that materialists tend to think of as characteristic of conscious beings, the United States seems to have those things. So think about the United States as a giant planet-sized entity might, right? So you imagine you're a giant planet-sized entity, you're looking at Earth, you see these people organized into a group. Think of them, individual people, almost like cells in this large organism, right? So this large organism, the United States, it sends out like a pseudopod to Iraq and invades Iraq, right? When it does so in a pretty sophisticated way. So for example, there's a mountain here. It doesn't crash into the mountain. It detects the mountain, moves its pseudopod around the mountain, right? It attacks this army in a sophisticated way, withdraws. The United States imports nutrients from the environment, like fossil fuels. It does so in response to the represented price of those fuels. The United States cooperates with other organisms of its kind. Germany enters conflicts with organisms of its kind, does a variety of kind of seemingly social activities. There's a massive amount of information exchange among the members of the United States, comparable to the amount of information exchange inside a human brain.
So if we allow the analogy, do we then say one of two things must be true? Either the results are so absurd that we have to reject the premises, and therefore this is a refutation of materialism, or that if we assume materialism is going to be real, we have to allow for the possibility that what we think is an absurd conclusion is a forced conclusion of necessity, that counterintuitive things are true. It's one of those two.
Yes, but I would also just highlight that you started with an if,
Yeah.
right? So I want to put that third one out there too, which is there probably are materialist ways out of this conclusion. Like, so for example, you could deny that rabbits are conscious, right? Or you could say, look, there's a structural feature that the United States doesn't have, but that human beings and rabbits have, that's necessary for consciousness. Now, I think that there's some pressure against that when you think about alien cases, because it seems like you can construct aliens in all kinds of ways that would emit highly sophisticated behavior.
Yeah, but I use your United States as a metaphor, because we have 300 million people, and maybe it doesn't work with 300 million. Maybe you need 300 trillion. Okay, but it's the same principle.
Yeah, okay, I think that's all right. I mean, it seems to me like probably most materialists ought to say that if individual people were organized in sophisticated enough a way, that consciousness would emerge. Unless, for some reason or other, but I don't see what this reason would be, you think that it just is impossible to create consciousness at a higher level out of individually conscious beings. I mean, some people have said stuff like that, but I've never really seen a good argument for it. It doesn't seem like the most natural thing to draw from materialism.